This is Dr. James Reaney, and I'm once again taking control of the airwaves to bring you yet another installment of Letting Destiny Deliver, the prescription for self-health. With the first 5 parts under your belt, you are well into this journey through the fabric of social and instinctual forces that drive you as a mind, as a body, and as a spirit. By this point, you have at your disposal the 10 pathways, as well as other information that gives you the skinny on how to tame the opposing forces of conscious and unconscious mind, pain and pleasure, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. Part 6 is now ready and waiting for you. It's waiting in the wings, ready to enter your auditory canal to expand your awareness of human consciousness. Part 6 is all about the power and magic of fantasy. Part 5 was important because it explained the ego's role as the fantasy police. This role, which gives the ego a dominant position in self-development, greatly impacts the overall stability of the self. Fantasy, believe it or not, also exerts tremendous power over the self. This is why the ego must be healthy, because not only does it impact the unconscious self, but also the world of fantasy. This self-health prescription provides you with a fine-tuned perspective of human nature and human consciousness. It does so in order to help you better understand and take control of the forces that shape and define who you are. This is absolutely necessary because the same opposing forces that drive human nature and human consciousness also create gaps in our awareness. These gaps are dynamic as they compel us to fill them with either fantasy or action. How we fill these gaps determine whether we achieve self-health or self-sabotage. Since the dawn of recorded time, ego consciousness has sought to bridge the gaps in awareness between the known and the unknown. Consciousness, which has only been around for a brief moment compared to how long our planet has been traveling through the universe of time, has been responsible for powerful inventions, discoveries, and timeless works of art. Because of fantasy, we stand on the brink of a bold new era of information and consciousness. It remains to be seen, however, if we will use the power of information and consciousness to usher in a new age of understanding, cooperation, and human development. With consciousness has come a vital key to our survival: fantasy. Fantasy is indispensable as a tool because it allows us to plan, analyze, rehearse, visualize, and talk subvocally. Fantasy, a super network of images and ideas, allows us to manipulate complex information at the very speed of light. If the boiler room is what provides the power to drive a ship, then fantasy provides the power to drive the mind. As such, the fantasies we entertain go a long way in determining whether we reach our destination or not. Consciousness through fantasy helps transform the potential of mind, body, and spirit into reality. One of the things that makes fantasy mighty is the way it allows us to carry on an as-if existence. Through the magic of fantasy, we can imagine all kinds of things. We can transport ourselves anywhere and do anything in our minds. If we are deep enough, the fantasy can seem real, just like a dream seems real. Fantasy, for all practical purposes, is imagination and serves as a tremendous aid to consciousness in not only filling gaps in awareness, but also in our quest for knowledge, understanding, and competence. Through the ages, fantasy has helped us devise complex languages, tools, technologies, and vast systems of information highways. The most recent chapter in this amazing story of human consciousness reveals the fastest information highway the world has ever known. Now, without ever leaving home, we can reach out to anywhere on the planet instantly, gaining access to all kinds of information and bringing it to conscious awareness. These same roads, intended to help us band together and to help us become more knowledgeable and aware, can just as easily be used to spread misinformation and distortions as they can to further truth and connections. As we satisfy our appetites for information and knowledge, our worlds become more and more complex. To survive the complexity of the information age, it is imperative that we remain connected to self and others. So the questions remain: will this infinite stream of information and knowledge empower us to grow, or will it drown us in a flood of babble? Will we use fantasy to distort and destroy, or to discover and develop? Will we fill the gaps in awareness with toxicity or nourishment? These questions are important because fantasy is a powerful force that goes a long way in defining the self. Looking at the lives of Jeffrey Dahmer and Carl Sagan will make it clear just how instrumental fantasy is in this regard. Although these two men represent extreme cases, they nonetheless illustrate the power of fantasy to define the self. Jeffrey Dahmer, the serial killer, had fantasies about cutting people up. These fantasies, which began around adolescence, seized his mind for a lifetime. On the other end of the spectrum, there was Carl Sagan, who, as a little boy, imagined life on other planets and space travel. He wound up being an award-winning scientist for NASA. Sagan turned his fantasies into reality and fulfilled his destiny. Dahmer realized his fantasies, but instead fulfilled a twisted fate. Why would Jeffrey Dahmer, a man from a seemingly normal background, commit such hideous crimes? Traveling back to Dahmer's childhood provides us with some answers. His early childhood was one of extreme tension. The tension came from the relationship that existed at that time between his mother and father. Although he was not abused, his parents were constantly at each other's throats. He felt neglected by his parents. When upset, Dahmer would storm out of the house, go to the wooded backyard, and slam sticks against the trees. In high school, still feeling ignored, Jeffrey would act the fool to get attention. This neglect and the ensuing social inadequacies blocked Dahmer's self-development and eventually led to a disturbed view of self and of his purpose in the world. Dahmer's ego, disconnected from self and others, could not deal with the tension of being different and disconnected. In an effort to lessen this tension, Dahmer resorted to filling in the gaps between self and others with perverted fantasy and alcohol abuse. By the time he was 16, he was already a heavy drinker. Unfortunately, neither alcohol nor perverted fantasy could fill the emptiness of being alone or disconnected. Dahmer stated that he did not get his ideas for cutting up or killing people from TV, books, or magazines, and that he felt power in the fact that they were his own private thoughts. Since he could not get power any other way or tell anybody about his fantasies, he learned to enjoy being in his own private fantasy world that belonged to no one else. Had Dahmer been better connected to self and others, he might have met a kinder fate. Instead, Dahmer's disconnect left gaps in him that his ego did not know how to fill. Unlike Dahmer, Carl Sagan's parents had a magical connection as they had an unusually close and loving relationship. When Carl was born, his parents were intent on making the best possible life for their child. His mother thought the sun rose and set on him. She watched over him and was very concerned that he fulfill his potential. She was a natural student and passed this on to Carl. When Carl was 4, his parents took him to the 1939 World's Fair. Carl was captivated by this wonderful vision of the future. The fair sparked dreams of lights in the sky, and Carl began dreaming of stars. At the age of 7, he read an entire book on astronomy in one sitting. In a big bang of consciousness, the scale of the universe opened up for him, causing him to think that there was a good chance that life existed on other planets.
It's puzzling. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before.
The possibility of life on other planets charmed and excited him, even at this very young age. To keep his imagination sparked, he read science fiction books about life on Mars and fantasized about being transported there. All of these things contributed to his growing up to be a unique kind of astronomer, the kind who loved putting his mind to work on finding ways to reach out to intelligent life on other planets. Carl Sagan devoted his whole life to the exploration of the grandeur and mystery of the universe, and in the process fulfilled his destiny. As a little boy, Sagan was driven by the same controversial question that would become his life's work: are we alone in the universe? In an effort to answer that question, he created his own career track. He imagined it and, with hard work, turned it into reality. He was a gifted storyteller filled with ideas as big as the galaxy. The former Harvard and Cornell professor turned his fantasies and talents into a long list of accomplishments, which included a television series called The Cosmos, where he shared his love for science with the world. Unlike Dahmer, Carl Sagan's parents nurtured him with love, belonging, respect, and encouraged his individuality. They nurtured his desire to learn and taught him how to make connections with people. They empowered him to develop a sense of self and to make that ultimate connection with destiny. There were many things that affected Jeffrey Dahmer's self-development. one of which was a high school biology class where he had to dissect animals. This class introduced him to a strange kind of excitement. With Jeffrey Dahmer as with Carl Sagan, the outside world played an active role in activating their fantasy lives and their inner potentials. What the outside world activates, however, depends in large part on the self-health of the inner world of fantasy. What I am saying is that fantasy is to consciousness what the heart is to the body. It is that important. To have a healthy heart, there are certain things you need to do and certain things that you want to avoid. The same is true if you want a healthy fantasy life. With that in mind, let's explore the things that impact the fantasy zone. The mind, or what might just as well be called the fantasy zone, is negatively affected by such things as prejudice, obsessive behavior, envy, greed, fear, jealousy, and excuses that keep you from accepting responsibility. These attitudes short-circuit fantasy's effectiveness because prejudice, envy, greed, and the like are all psychologically toxic forces that affect the ego's grasp on reality. These forces act to produce a film over the mind like the film that over time forms on windows, reducing clarity and visibility. Toxic thinking clogs the mind like fat and cholesterol clog the arteries. A philosopher once said, "As a man thinketh he is." So be careful not to underestimate the power of thought, because turning fantasy into reality is easier than you think. Unfortunately, like most things, negative thoughts are easier to realize than positive thoughts. Fulfilling positive fantasies are more difficult because they require ongoing effort, whereas fulfilling negative fantasies are easier as they are harder to let go of and therefore more likely to become self-fulfilling. Fantasy is used to fill in the gaps when we don't know something or don't have something we want. These gaps are often filled with negative forces such as envy, greed, jealousy, catastrophic fantasies of gloom and doom, or grandiose fantasies of invincibility and greatness. These are toxic forces because they don't adequately fill the gaps. What they do instead is provide us with an unrealistic account of what is not known, and therefore are not useful at giving us what we need or want. Using toxic forces to fill in the gaps in our awareness is detrimental to the self-health system. It is much better to fill the gaps with nourishing forces such as love, respect, understanding, creativity, self-development, and spirituality. Fantasies are a rich source of creativity and intuition that exist at both a conscious level and an unconscious level. Because fantasy exists on these two levels, it is multidimensional. This multidimensional effect is created by the way the conscious and unconscious mind differ when it comes to processing information. The conscious mind prefers to think logically, rationally, and looks for cause and effect relationships, or why things happen. The conscious mind is digital. The unconscious prefers emotion, intuition, and is capable of detecting hidden messages. The unconscious, unlike the conscious, is analogical and metaphorical. The need consciousness has to fill the gaps in awareness further underscores the necessity of having a healthy flow of information from one mind to the other. Practically speaking, this means the conscious mind must recognize the needs of the unconscious so they can be understood and properly expressed by consciousness. This is crucial because most every conscious act or event has an unconscious meaning that can only be realized as an afterthought, an intuition, or upon deeper reflection. Getting access to these intuitions and deeper meanings that are unconsciously based are key as they serve to keep the conscious mind's fantasies on track and the gap between the two minds negligible. If the conscious mind doesn't get access to the afterthoughts, intuitions, and deeper meanings present in the unconscious, it will deprive itself of valuable mental connections that it can use to continue growing and developing. Too often the conscious mind loses access to the unconscious because it becomes fixated by routine, excitement, or anxiety. This is exactly why the ego cannot become overly rigid or entertain too many fantasies that are prejudiced or one-sided, because without quite realizing it, it will selectively distort the meaning of things as well as wrongly interpret the emotional, intuitive, and instinctual needs of the unconscious. The ego must be limber enough to make its way through the multidimensional nature of meaning in order to select the meaning or meanings that keep it properly connected to self and others. The multidimensional nature of meaning makes it easy to come up with a variety of meanings in any given situation. This can make for fun and inspiration, or it can create strain, misunderstanding, and confusion. Therefore, it is important to be aware of your state of mind, as well as the state of mind of others if you want to understand what is being communicated. Knowing your mind and that of others helps you put information in the right context. Take, for example, the two words "a run," which can mean a run in your stockings, a run of luck, a run in the paint, a run of fish, or a run in baseball. The meaning the two words will have depends on the context in which they are used and on whether the speaker and listener are women, gamblers, painters, fishermen, or baseball players. Here's a real-life example. One time my wife and I were driving out of the city on the interstate in 5 o'clock traffic. About an hour into the ride, my wife looks up from the book she was reading intently and says, "It's cleared up." My thought was, what is she talking about? It seemed to me that it had just begun to cloud up. Doubting myself, I looked the sky over, trying to see how she could see it as clearing. Then I realized she was referring to the traffic. Since the traffic had cleared up some time before, I wasn't even thinking about that meaning. However, just before she made that comment, I did notice it clouding up. Since I was in a different place in my conscious mind, I misinterpreted her statement. To truly understand, I had to regain access to the thought patterns in my unconscious of an hour ago. This led me back to our earlier conversation about the traffic, which then gave her words relevant meaning. My point is that meaning is bifurcated. That is, it exists on two levels simultaneously, the conscious and the unconscious. How and when the two levels or meanings come to meet in consciousness is another matter altogether. Sometimes an unconscious meaning comes to us later, out of nowhere. A good joke will trigger both conscious and unconscious meanings simultaneously. What makes jokes funny are the unexpected meanings generated by the unconscious coming to consciousness at the speed of light. What this means is that understanding is affected by having two minds. The conscious mind can have one point of view while the unconscious has another. Take, for example, a dream where I was playing a pinball machine when the alarm clock went off. The unconscious heard the sound and took it to mean I had tilted. This interpretation worked with the unconscious because it fit nicely into the context of the dream. The same thing happened another time when I dreamt I was at Kennedy Space Center watching the launch of a rocket. As the rocket was lifting off in my dream, the unconscious heard the sound of a jackhammer that was being used next door. The sound of the jackhammer was interpreted by the unconscious as the sound of the rocket engine. These are clear examples of how the two minds have the ability to come up with different interpretations for the same event. In this case, the event was a sound. The unconscious meaning makes sense within the context of the dream, but not in the context of the real world. The same thing can happen to us in the waking state. If we are absorbed in our own fantasy world, and an event is taking place simultaneously in the outside world, we can misinterpret it due to the context created by the fantasy. Because of these things, the boundary between the inner world and the outer world becomes blurred, and meaning can easily become distorted. In everyday life, there are many things such as depression, limiting beliefs, and misinformation that can cause the mind to distort meaning. Therefore, keeping the fantasy zone free from depression, misinformation, and limited beliefs is essential if you want to have self-help. Rigid thinking and prejudice negatively affect the fantasy zone. This is because rigid thinking and prejudice force us to assign the same meaning to different things. As the associative matrix is more and more controlled by rigid thinking and prejudice, we become more prone to automatically assign the same meanings over and over again. This increases the likelihood that we will distort meaning and decreases the likelihood of being able to successfully discriminate one situation or meaning from another. Under normal circumstances, when we are trying to sort things out, we automatically undergo a search consciously and unconsciously to see what meaning makes sense. We keep searching until one comes along that satisfies the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, or both. To make the kind of sense out of things you need to increase your ability to discern one meaning from another. To do this, you must be free of prejudices or mindsets so you don't jump so quickly to the same old conclusions. You also need to explore and learn other interpretations and the different conclusions they may hold. Jeffrey Dahmer, after going to live with his grandmother, attempted to follow the straight and narrow by going to church, by not drinking, and by holding down a job. In spite of all these efforts, he killed a second time while in a drunken state. After killing the second time, he came to believe there was no God and that he himself was an instrument of evil. That is when he decided to stop fighting the impulses to kill and instead follow them. Dahmer was unable to follow the straight and narrow because it had no real meaning for him at an unconscious level. Because of the neglect, estrangement, and the unusual connection between cutting up dead animals and sexual excitement, Dahmer's associative matrix became warped at the unconscious level. Therefore, his conscious effort to live up to some externally derived concept of who he should be was ineffective at suppressing or replacing his greater identification with his homicidal and sexual fantasies. These fantasies, because they were exciting and so much a part of him, had a strong influence over how he defined himself and his purpose in the world. So much so that eventually there was no boundary between his fantasies and reality. Our reality is determined by how the conscious and unconscious minds interact to generate meaning. They literally feed off each other. So beware of the fixed ideas of the conscious mind and the emotional habits of the unconscious, as they can limit your ability to distinguish what is in your mind from what is really taking place. Know yourself well enough so you can put things in the right context and interpret experience with greater accuracy. Know yourself well enough to be in communication with your unconscious so it doesn't have to overpower the conscious mind. Bear in mind that the inability to do these things will result in history repeating itself. You will get the same results simply because you are imposing the same meanings over and over again. The renowned psychiatrist Abraham Maslow said, "If your only tool is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail." In other words, if you can only see things one way, then everything is going to look the same. As human beings, we have a need to communicate and socialize. Therefore, the better we are at understanding fantasy, the multiple levels of meaning created by conscious and unconscious mind, and the influence of context on meaning, the more we will be able to clear up perceptual distortions about self and others. Rather than seeing things through a myopic lens, you need to have stereoscopic vision. If you don't want to be a prisoner behind the bars of rigid thinking and the same old, then you cannot be one-sided in your thinking. If you choose to be myopic, you will be unable to see the bigger picture. The unseen portions will then occupy your unconscious thinking and come back to haunt you. They will take control by affecting your ability to understand what is really happening, just as the unconscious took control of what the alarm clock going off in the dream meant. Fantasy allows us to manipulate reality and meaning. If you are serious about taking personal control of your life and mind, you will need to have a healthy understanding of how conscious and unconscious mind bifurcate meaning. You will need to use and understand this prescription. Most of us are unfamiliar with the multiple levels of meaning present in communication. Because of this, we keep repeating the same mistakes and having the same misunderstandings. Only through conscious receptivity, effort, and reflection will you discover the deeper and more accurate meanings and understandings you need to ensure that you perceive events accurately. So beware of the tendency to hear certain meanings more so than others, and therefore interpret everything under the same heading. Bring yourself out of the dark ages and break free of mindsets and the myth that your life is not a part of the bigger picture. History shows us that all over the world, from time immemorial, the powers to be have controlled people by keeping them ignorant. The powers to be perpetuated this ignorance by instilling limited thinking, by being oppressive, and making the individual feel powerless and insignificant. This strategy, although it may be effective at controlling the masses, is short-sighted because it undermines self-health. Carl Sagan is an example of self-health, Jeffrey Dahmer an example of oppression and ignorance. One made many positive contributions to the world while the other left a path of destruction. Fantasy, the stuff that mind is made of, is the bedrock of consciousness and has as its quest the desire to be transformed into reality. How fantasy is handled by and large is determined by the ego, since it is the fantasy police. Because the ego plays such a dominant role in the flow of information between the conscious and unconscious mind, and between the inner and outer worlds, it must be properly organized. This is key because more than anything else, ego and fantasy determine whether we achieve self-health or self-sabotage. The segments that follow will provide you with the fine-tuned perspective of human interaction, time, and human consciousness you need to have to develop a well-organized ego. They provide you not only with the understandings your ego needs, but also specifics and applications that will allow you to take control of the forces that shape and define who you are. This concludes Part 6 of Letting Destiny Deliver, the Prescription for Self-Health.